5,000 years ago, the ancient Egyptians began settling urban communities on the banks of the Nile. These communities developed later from initially small villages to what we can call by the standards of that time, megacities, which at certain times included tens of thousands of residents. Every year, the lands of Egypt were engulfed by the Nile flood. Motivating to survive, the Nile rats fled from its habitat to these densely populated cities. To these rats, the fleas carrying the bacterium that causes bubonic plague had previously moved, coming from black rats that arrived in Egypt through international trade from Central Asia and India via Mesopotamia in different historical periods. Hence, the Egyptian historical records refer to the plague frequently. The first time plague is mentioned in the Ebers Papyrus, a medical papyrus dated to around 1500 BC, but probably compiled much earlier. If thou examinest the man who suffers from the said suffering for hours, like consuming turbulency, and he is weak like a breath that passes away, and the accumulation has reduced the pupil, and the pus has petrified, the disease is it. Thou shalt prepare him remedies to open it by means of medicines. Another tentative description of a disease that could be the plague is found in the Hearst medical papyrus. A text is dated to 1520 BC, describing one of the incantations against the Canaanite illness, who is knowledgeable like Ra, who knows the like of this god. When the body is blackened with black spots, to arrest the god who is above, just as Seth had banned the Mediterranean Sea, Seth will ban you likewise. O Canaanite illness, you shall not intend to pass through the limbs. The following story bears evidence that largely believed to indicate a widespread outbreak of bubonic plague in Egypt at the end of the Bronze Age. Pharaoh Amenhotep III ordered hundreds of statues of the lion-headed goddess Sekhmet to be made. Sekhmet was thought to bring epidemics, but also to remove them from society. One of Amarna's letters, written under his son Akhenaten, which mentioned the plague in the time of his father. The decision of Amenhotep III to relocate his palace to Malkata on the western bank near Thebes, in a somewhat isolated location, might be one of the first known mitigating strategies of isolation known in history. It's possible that a decade later, an epidemic broke out in the new residence of Akhenaten in Tell el-Amarna during the 14th year of King's reign. The village of the necropolis, workmen in Deir el-Medina, was destroyed by a fire. This may have been by accident, or in a view of an epidemic, an attempt to purge the village from a disease. Therefore, based on the foregoing, it has become widely believed that ancient Egypt was the birthplace of the bubonic plague in the world, and from which it moved to Europe later, denying the previously popular belief that it was Central Asia. This was confirmed by a paper published in 2004 in the Journal of Biogeography, suggested that the black rats that arrived in Egypt from the east acquired the flea that hosted the plague bacteria from the Egyptian Nile rats, and later carried them on board merchant ships to southern Europe. But was the plague really transmitted from Egypt to Europe through rats? Or perhaps in another shocking and unexpected way? By the end of the Middle Ages, a terrible practice spread across Europe within the wave of ignorance and backwardness that had struck the continent during this period. As European smugglers flocked to Egypt and stole mummies from tombs, which were later sold in their homelands. As mummies were eaten in European homes and streets over hundreds of years later, the Egyptian mummies were sold in apothecaries in various forms, whether crushed or chopped, which was called mumia. Mumia was eaten by the Europeans in the belief that it had supernatural healing powers. They believed it cures many diseases including the plague. So, our theory here is that, on the contrary, this horrific practice contributed to the spread of bubonic plague throughout Europe during the pandemic of the Black Death that struck Europe at the height of this practice, if not with the main reason for the pandemic to reach and strike Europe in the first place, instead of the rats theory. The Black Death resulted in the deaths of 75 to 2,000 million people, according to some estimates. It's likely that over 4 years, 45 to 50% of the European population died of plague. And all in all, the Black Death is considered to be the most fatal pandemic recorded in human history. The mummy theory was confirmed by a 2004 paper published by Society for Science and the Public in Science News. Barbara Ann Carter of the California State University in Los Angeles suggested that people who consumed or applied European-produced mumia were being exposed to disease agents. Parasites can survive within recently dried fish, she notes. So, human parasites could probably have remained viable within the European mumia. Circumstantial evidence also suggested that some bacteria, including the microbe that caused plague, might have found refuge in the mummies. She adds, between 1720 and 1722, France experienced several outbreaks of plague, the largest of which occurred in Marseille, a major mummy-making center. Most researchers attribute the spread of plague among people to bites from rat fleas infected with the plague's microbe, because that's how the disease is usually transmitted today, says Carter. However, rat fleas are dormant in winter months, but the French outbreaks, as well as many European plagues of previous centuries, occurred in all seasons. Furthermore, there is scant documentary or archaeological evidence for inordinate infestations of rats during those outbreaks. Maybe, Carter suggests, many European plague outbreaks were, in fact, a curse of the mummy, which, according to our theory, may also goes for the largest outbreak in history, the Black Death that took place in the 14th century. Of course, this remains an uncertain theory that needs further research and study to fully confirm it, but it sheds light on a series of historical events that fall within what is known as the curse of the pharaohs or the curse of the mummy, some of which have a scientific or logical explanation, and others do not. Perhaps, our theory may be one of the few documented incidents that chronicle Aryan mummies' revenge for the desecration of them. The revenge that the ancient Egyptians had always promised the aggressors on the walls of their tombs. Also, the evidence aboard in the series seemed to have solid scientific basis, which opens the door to more questions and calls for further research and study in the near future.